Hello again. Welcome to our continuing series discussing a probing of the Genesis creation account, contemporary approaches to the creation account and validity in hermeneutics. In a previous episode number 2, we surveyed 8 different evangelical views of the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2. The young earth view, the gap theory, the pre-creation chaos theory, the promised land view, the old earth views, the figurative day views, cosmic temple view, and theistic evolution. Of course, the view that's been advocated for in this series, which I hold to, is the young earth view, the traditional view of the creation account in 6 literal days. Well, we raised the question, though, when we looked at this chart, so what makes for such a difference among evangelicals? Why is it that we can't agree to what the text is saying? Well, broadly speaking, I presented the idea that there was really 3 key factors that contribute to the difference in our understanding. The first of these is how they understand the relationship of the first 3 verses, Genesis 1, 1 to 3. That is, what's the syntactical relationship between these verses. Now, this was covered in episode 3 of this series, if you want to go back and take a look at that. The second key factor, how do these scholars handle the exegesis of various details throughout Genesis chapters 1 and 2 combined? And that got us into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of what the text is saying and what it means from an exegetical level. And that was covered in episode number 4. And you can go back and review that episode. You can also download the set of notes that go with it. I think there's 20-something pages dealing with the exegetical details. The third key factor was the extent to which these scholars employ a literal hermeneutic. Obviously, some do more so than others, and that was a major issue that was covered in episode 5 of this series. Now, in part 6 that we'll be looking at today, we're dealing with the dating of the creation and the flood accounts in light of Genesis 5 and 11. And we'll see why Genesis 5 and 11 play a crucial part in our understanding about this whole discussion. So it's not a matter of just how we understand Genesis 1. Some people would think there was a gap of time or 2 creations in view or something like that. I've advocated in this series that Genesis chapter 1 presents one creation account, the absolute beginning of creation, in 6 literal 24-hour days, sequential days. But we want to also try to compare that with Genesis 5 and 11 to see where this would lead us in terms of dating these things overall. So I'll begin by comparing 2 genealogies, one before the flood, before Noah's flood, and the other one after the flood, the post-flood genealogy. So in Genesis 5, we are given this genealogy prior to the flood, from Adam to Noah. There's 10 names in this list. So we have Adam, his son Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Yared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, and Noach. A second panel, although I do also begin with Noah and take it all the way to the father of Avram, that is Terach, we have 10 names. Noach, his son Shem, who was on the ark, Arpachshad, Shelach, Ever, Peleg, Ruah, Serug, Nahor, and Terach. Now it's interesting as we compare the first panel with the second panel, that the first panel ends in a man, that is Noach, having 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But so does the second panel, because Terach is the father of Ram, Nahor, and Haran. So it's interesting that we have this symmetry there between these 2 genealogical accounts. The question, though, that comes out of this, are these tight genealogies? That is, are they without gaps? Is every father and son listed from the first person in the list to the last person in the list? If there is a gap, then we would not know how long of a period of time might be missing in our data, and therefore the dating of creation, the dating of the flood could be much earlier than it would be otherwise. In November of 2016, I was privileged to present a paper at the annual meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society. The paper was entitled The Genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, Reasons for Understanding These as Gapless Chronologies. And this paper, by the way, is available to you. It's handout number 17 that's provided here on the website. Now, it's a rather lengthy article, I think of over 30 pages, but I lay out this whole discussion about whether there's gaps or not, and I come to the conclusion that there are no gaps, that every father and son was listed. And obviously I don't have time right now to go into all the detail that was behind this conclusion. You've got the paper there if you care to read it for yourself. But I did defend the view that in the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 that they are tight without gaps. Now, what I want to do right now is just hit a few highlights of the conclusions that I came to in this paper. The first argument that these are without gaps is that there's no clue in the text itself or elsewhere in Scripture that there are gaps. So if there was something here in the text that would anyone indicate that there ought to be a gap, or we ought to understand it has a gap, that'd be one thing. But we're not, and there's no apparent gap to us. That doesn't prove it, but the burden of proof, I think, lies with those who would contend that there are gaps. The second argument that these are gapless genealogies is that many of the names are known to be a literal father and son. For example, in the first panel, in Genesis 5, Adam, we know, is the literal father of Seth. We also know that Seth is the literal father of Enosh. And later in the same panel, we see that Methuselah is the father of Lamech, and Lamech of Noach. And there's even reasons for naming of the sons that are given there. In the second panel, the Genesis 11 genealogy, we know that Noach was the father of Shem. We know that the text tells us very explicitly that Shem was the father of Arpachshad, and that Ever was the father of Peleg, and later that Terach was the father of Avram, Nahor, and Haran. So we may not have, the text may not be explicit that all these were literal father and son, but we know that a number of them were, which I think argues in favor of the fact that they all are. A third argument is that the author is very tedious about giving the ages at birth and how long each person lived afterwards. So we're told, for example, at least in the Hebrew account, that Adam was 130 years old when he fathered Seth, and then he lived so many years after Seth. Then all the years of Adam were such and such. So we have, and it does like that, all the way through. Worded slightly different in the Genesis 11 genealogy, but still there's this tedious giving of ages and dates and the length of life that are there. We wouldn't expect that, if there was gaps to be had. A fourth argument, and this is a little bit more of a technical one here, is that in the Hebrew text, we're not told that someone is the father and someone else is the son, but rather we have a hifil form of the Hebrew verb yalad, which means to father or to give birth to. If it had been worded in terms of father and son, that would allow for gaps. And the reason for that is that the Hebrew word for father, which is av, can also mean grandfather, or perhaps even a great-grandfather, And the Hebrew word for son, ben, could be a literal son, it could be a grandson. But those aren't the words that are used here. Instead, we have this hifl form of the verb yalad, cause to father, or give birth to is the idea there. And when we do a detailed study about the usage of the hifl form of this verb, I think it argues for the fact that these would be literal fathers and son. And all that will be documented in the paper. Now, this raises a question. If the creation account happened in 6 24-hour days, and there are no gaps in the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11, do we then have enough data in the Old Testament to calculate the date of creation and the flood? And the answer to that is, in general, yes, we do. We know the date of the Exodus event. We know the date of Abraham's birth. And from that, we can work backward with the information in Genesis 5 and 11 to make these calculations. In January of 2015, an article appeared in the scholarly journal of Dallas Seminary, which is called Bibliotheca Sacra, an article that I had written on Old Testament chronology and its implications for the creation and flood accounts. Now, you have a copy of that here on the website. It's handout number 18, so you'll be able to download that and read it for yourself if you care to. Basically, what I did in this paper is to try to look at the data in the Old Testament itself and put this all together to see what kind of a chronological scheme would the Bible lead us to, both back to the flood and all the way back to creation itself. Now, I would like to clarify that I was basing that on the Hebrew text, and as you know, there is a translation of the Old Testament Hebrew text into Greek called the Septuagint, and that'll come out a little bit differently, but I'll comment on that in a moment. For the purposes of this paper, I went with the Hebrew Masoretic text. So, the note here, these figures are based on the Hebrew Masoretic text, which differs from the Greek Septuagint. If you're not familiar with some of this terminology, Masoretic text simply means that there was a group of Jewish scholars called the Masoretes who fixed the final form of the Hebrew text, put in vowel pointing that was not there originally, and so forth. And most of that came hundreds of years after the time of Christ, by the way. Okay, now this is a little bit of a summary of that paper that I wrote about Old Testament chronology. So over here on the right-hand side, you see an image, an archaeological find called the Kirk Monolith. It was written in Mesopotamian language regarding the Battle of Karkar, which took place in 853 BC. It was shortly after that battle that King Ahab died. Now, that date is a very fixed date for us because it's coordinated with the Syrian chronological records. So we have the biblical records, the Syrian chronological records, and those meet at that point, and we have very good documentation, for that. So if that battle took place in 853 BC, and it was shortly after that King Ahab dies, we can construct our earlier Old Testament chronology based on that fact. So, by the way, this little summary here about Old Testament chronology is in a handout number 19, a little 2-page write-up that I did that reveals how the major things that I used to track the dating. So, if it is true that King Ahab died in 853 BC, then we have the dating in the Old Testament to know that Rehoboam, the king of the southern kingdom, his inauguration would have been in 931 BC, and he was preceded by his father Solomon, who had a 40-year reign. So Solomon would have come to the throne in 971 BC. We're told in the text in 1 Kings chapter 6 that it was during Solomon's fourth regnal year that the temple was started, so that would be 967 BC. And in that verse in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, we can get a date of the Exodus because it tells us that it was 480 years after the date of the Exodus. Now you have to back up 479 years, and that would give you the time for the Exodus. So based upon that verse, then it was 1446 BC that the Exodus event took place. From that, we can go then to Exodus chapter 12, verses 40 through 41. We're told that it was 430 years after the Hebrews entered Egypt that the Exodus event took place. In fact, it's very precise. It says to the very day. Well, what do we mean by the Hebrews entering Egypt? Well, we don't mean Joseph going into Egypt when he was sold by his brothers as a slave, but rather when the father and all the family came up to Egypt and they were presented before Pharaoh. That's when the nation, we might say, the Hebrews as a people group, entered Egypt. So we know that that would have occurred then in 1876 BC, 430 years prior to the Exodus. Now we have plenty of other numerical dating in Genesis to regarding Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We can use this data to establish that Abraham would have been born in 2166 BC. Now, up to this point, it's, I think, very agreed upon, at least among conservative evangelical scholars. There are a number of other people that are not so conservative that argue for a late date of the Exodus, but this would be taking the numerical data at face value and allowing for the fact that we had 480 years after the Exodus that the temple building was started, or that it was built. So getting back to Abraham, I think is pretty on solid ground at this point. Now going back further from Abraham is a little bit where there might be more debate about that particular point. Now, we have one small problem, and that's that Abraham, or Avram, as he was initially known as, was not Terach's firstborn son. I don't have time to go into discussion about that right now. It is in the papers that I presented to you, both in the longer article from Bibliotheca Sacra, as well as in the 2-page summary that I gave you. But we can determine an approximate date of Terach's birth, at least within 25 years of that. So I would give Terach's birth at 2321 BC, plus or minus 25 years. And then we have, of course, we can utilize the dates in Genesis 11. If we believe that every father and son is listed to get us back to the flood, and by using that data, then the flood would be 2543 BC, plus or minus 25 years. We would have the birth of Noah, knowing that he was 600 years old at the time of the flood, so his birth would have been 3143 BC. And then we can use the genealogical data in Genesis 5 to actually come up with the date of creation, because adding all the dates of the fathers and sons, it would have been 1056 years prior to Noah's birth that we would have had a creation and the birth of Adam. And that would be 4199 BC, plus or minus 25 years. So I'll highlight those two dates, the date of the Noah's flood and the date of creation. The conclusion from this is that the creation account in Genesis 1 to 2 took place approximately 4,200 years before the time of Christ. That is, if the numbers of the Hebrew Masoretic text were followed. Keep in mind the Septuagint numbers, that is, the data in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, differs considerably, and we would come with different dates for the flood and for creation. So now this gets into a lot more technical discussion. Um, I just pointed out that the Hebrew Masoretic text, the MT, does differ from the Septuagint, both in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. And here I give you a lot of the manuscript evidence behind this. Now this will be provided for you as handout number 20 on the website, and you can look at this for yourself. So I'll try to explain what we have here. On the left-hand side of the chart, we have the names starting with Adam and his son Seth and so forth all the way down to Noah. And then after the flood, we have Shem, his son Arpachshad, and going to Terach, who's the father of Ram. And the Hebrew Masoretic text would tell us that Adam was 130 years old when he gave birth to Seth. That may sound incredible by today's ages and expectations, but that's what the text tells us. And you can see how old each father was when he gave birth to his firstborn son in these genealogical accounts. The next column over is SP, stands for the Samaritan Pentateuch. So the Samaritans they adhered to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and we do have copies of that. And for some of this is the same. That is, the Samaritan Pentateuch will be the same as the Masoretic text, but in other places it will differ. The next column over it says LXXA. Now LXX is the abbreviation for the Septuagint, if you're not familiar with that, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. We don't know the exact date of the Septuagint. It probably was not translated all at one time. We think that it was started roughly about 275 BC. Probably at that time they did the Pentateuch first, and in the years that followed, they would have completed the rest of the Hebrew Old Testament, all of which would have been completed long before the birth of Christ. But you can see in looking at this column that according to the Greek Septuagint, by the way, the little a stands for a particular manuscript of this because there are multiple manuscripts behind the Greek Septuagint. This is Alexandrinus. Anyway, and this manuscript copy of the Septuagint, it gives Adam's age as 230 at the time that Seth was born. And you can see that in general the ages in the Septuagint are generally longer. In some places they come out the same as the Hebrew, but typically longer. In the middle of the chart we have the remaining years of life after giving the firstborn son, and the final column over on the right-hand side, the age at the time of the death. And we can see that all the manuscripts agree that Adam was 930 years when he died. So this is all the data, and in fact on the handout I even give you, it's footnoted pretty heavily to give you a lot of documentation and technical details supporting this. Now, I want to make you aware of a paper written by a friend of mine by the name of Henry Smith, who presented this paper in 2018 called The Case for the Septuagint's Chronology in Genesis 5 and 11. Now, let me say this. I think among evangelical Old Testament scholars, the consensus opinion has been that the Hebrew Masoretic text has preserved the correct numerical data in contrast to the Septuagint. So usually when there's a difference between the two, scholars will side with the Hebrew Masoretic text. And that's kind of been the consensus view, I think, for a good many years. That's now being challenged. That's, of course, we've known about the difference, for ages. But Henry Smith has probably made the best case for arguing that it's not the Hebrew Masoretic text that preserves the correct numerical data for Genesis 5 and 11, but rather the Septuagint does. Now, I'm not here today to say one is right and the other is wrong. At this point, I'm trying to be open-minded about it and to at least consider that. I will say that Henry Smith has built the best case that I've seen for the superiority of the readings in the Septuagint. I'm remaining a little bit neutral on it. Myself, I would like to see how other evangelical Old Testament scholars react to his work and whether they feel like it's within that it's possible and even likely that we should be looking at the Septuagint figures. What I want to do in this next slide is let's compare these. I mean, if you went with the Hebrew Masoretic text, what would be the dates of these people versus going with the Greek Septuagint, what would the dates be? So once again, over on the column on the left, we have each individual listed out, starting with Adam and going all the way to Avram. And we finally notice that Avram departs Haran for Canaan in 2091 BC. And based upon all the numerical data in the Hebrew Masoretic text, as we said earlier, creation would have been about the year 4200 BC. The flood would have been about 2543 BC. Abram would have departed for Haran at age 75 in 2091 BC. However, if we go with the Septuagint data, which you see over in the right-hand column, again, Avram would have departed for Haran in 2091 BC. We agreed on that. But the data in Genesis 11 would take us back to a date of the flood at 3323 BC, and finally creation itself about 5585 BC. Now again, I think at this point we should remain a little bit open about which one of these might be the correct way to go. A couple of general comments. No matter which of these prove to be true, we're not talking about billions of years or millions of years before the time of Christ that creation took place. Either way you go, you have a relatively young Earth view. So if you're wanting to argue for evolution or a longer time, neither one of those are going to get you there that way. I will say this, in favor of the Septuagint, just slightly, it seems rather difficult to argue for the flood in 2543 BC, knowing that the pyramids are probably older than that, as well as other archaeological finds. A date of 3323 BC for the flood would certainly, I think, be more realistic in light of a lot of archaeological data we have. However, I don't want to go with that alone. One other thing I might want to point out that in this the list of names from Shem's son Arpachshad all the way to Avram, there is a name, Canaan, that the Hebrew Masoretic text does not even have, but is listed in the Greek Septuagint. Interestingly, in Luke chapter 3, at least in the best manuscripts we have of Luke, he does include the name Canaan. And actually Henry Smith has also written an article in defense of that as well. And so we have to do something about that. That is, at least we have to evaluate that and how does that affect our conclusions. So that's what I want to present about the dating of the flood account and the dating of creation. I personally hold to a literal view of creation in Genesis 1. I believe it happened in 6 literal 24-hour days that were sequential. And I believe by looking at the other data in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, we can establish a date for the flood and creation. It still leaves a little bit of discussion for whether we should go with the Hebrew Masoretic text or the Septuagint. Hopefully that as research continues and scholarship continues to work on that, we can come to a more definitive conclusion. So that's it for this episode. In the next episode, As part 7, I'll look at some concluding statements to our whole study about the biblical account of creation.